Welcome everyone to this session where we shall be briefly looking at a step-by-step methodology for social economic valuation of ecosystems. And it's my hope that this will be able to address some of the questions we are already receiving regarding the environment within which the products from the Colwed can be used to influence decision making or even the formulation of policies that would be touching on conservation, management, or even restoration of our resources. I know many of you might also be having the same thoughts and probably asking yourselves questions like, where do we place the implementation of the Colwed tool? Or besides, for the purposes of research and academia, how do we use the Colwed to influence decision making? Do you just wake up one day and value ecosystems? How do you get this valuable information to the right people? And many other relevant concerns. So remember, we said that the Colwed model was designed for valuation modeling purposes, but to make or to influence decision making, it should be used within an active social economic valuation decision making environment or framework that would involve different and very important stakeholders through a participatory process. So the methodology I'm going to talk about today is a generic methodology that we put together with references from various sources and also existing methodologies, including sources like the CGIAR, the Ramsar Convention, BirdLife International. We also picked some references from UNEP, the USAID, and many others. We also borrowed snippets of how countries have implemented their evaluation processes, in as much as mostly were for local level or site specific. They were very useful references, and we borrowed from quite a number of countries here in Africa, Asia, South America, and Eastern Europe. So allow me to say that for countries that do not have existing frameworks for social economic valuation of ecosystem services, this methodology will actually act as a good guide for starters. So the step-by-step methodology for social economic valuation of degraded lands and wetlands incorporates 4 major steps. We have the preliminary work, we have the scoping appraisal, the third one being the valuation modeling, where Colwed model comes in. And I'm sure right now we are quite acquainted with how to quantify and value ecosystems. And then lastly, we have, of course, ensuring that you communicate these economic values to the right people. So we will start with the preliminary work phase. And here the assumption is that in every country, there's always a department within a relevant ministry, like the Ministry of Environment, that is mandated to implement such processes. So the first thing that should be undertaken by the implementing body during the preliminary work is to set clear objectives. The social economic valuation of ecosystem services are best done within a decision-making context with very clear objectives. One thing we need to take note of is that the valuation processes are very context-specific and are mainly dependent on the type of the ecosystem as well as its level of degradation. And therefore, the implementing body undertaking the valuation process should in detail assess how well the study is designed in the context of the specific problem that it seeks to address. So the process should focus to ultimately provide information for the development or the implementation of policies or decisions that are relevant to the degraded site in question. So some of the key aspects that should be addressed or considered while setting clear objectives are, answering questions like why the economic valuation of the degraded ecosystem in question is necessary. We also need to try and understand how and where the output information will be used for. And this could be, for instance, to review the policy context of a certain degraded site, comprising of the decisions or policies that the assessment seeks to influence. Something else that is a key to understand is who the information is targeted at. This looks into the audience for communication and the type of information the targeted audience could be interested in. it is actually paramount to envision and work out how the results from the evaluation process are likely to be used in decision making way before the actualization process is started. So the next step is in the preliminary work is the definition of the assessment site. So after the objectives of the evaluation process have been clearly set, the study site is then physically defined. This is a site in which the evaluation exercise is going to be done and in which the data collection, of course, will be delimited to. For example, this could be degraded hotspots, earmarked landscapes, like probably a national park, a certain wetland, an important bird area, and so on and so forth. So the delineation of the site should be based on one, the non-biological importance of the degraded ecosystem, and two, the perceived threats and drivers of degradation. The delineation should also be done in accordance with the objectives set at the onset of the preliminary work. For example, if the degraded ecosystem is a wetland, the operative site would definitely be either the wetlands catchment area or the wetlands downstream area that is prone to flooding, or even both, depending on what exactly the objectives of your assessment is trying to achieve. So for the delineation, the assessors can use existing land use maps, satellite imagery, and even existing online gazetteers like Google Earth. So the next step in the preliminary work is a stakeholder analysis. So to assess this, the stakeholder analysis is one of the most, I would say, very critical stages of any social economic valuation, where a team to undertake the valuation is constituted. Remember, valuation process, for it to be credible and for its outputs be widely acceptable, then it has to be a highly participatory process that involves many different people and even institutions that have varying interests in a particular natural resource. So in order to assess the value of ecosystem services at any site in question, it is very imperative to identify people, groups and organizations who are key to involve in the evaluation process, or even who might be affected by the outcome of that particular evaluation process. So generally what we are saying or trying to say is that stakeholders are both the people with the power to control the use of resources like government, NGOs. We also have development partners who have interests in certain resources, and so on and so forth. Number two, we also are saying that this also should include those with no direct influence or any control of the use of the resource, but are the beneficiaries of that ecosystem. And most of the time, their livelihoods are affected by any change in the use of the resources. These are, for example, the local landowners. We have farmers, we have fishers, and so on and so forth. Stakeholder participation is therefore a very essential element in decision making, and it is considered critical because it not only results in better information and knowledge in terms of the objectives pointed out, but also it results in a much richer knowledge due to the pragmatic wide range of knowledge that most of the time stakeholders would bring to the table. So the necessity to include perspectives from various stakeholders is very important for understanding the potential strategies for sustainable ecosystem management, since these stakeholders have different stakes and will always have different perspectives on the management strategies. So there are three main steps that should be followed for an effective stakeholder analysis. The first one being, of course, identifying and selecting the stakeholders. We also have prioritizing them based on their importance and influence, and also involving them. So I want to briefly discuss each, and I will start with the first step, which is the identification and selection of stakeholders. So identifying the stakeholders marks the beginning of the formal stakeholder analysis process, and it is known to be the very first step towards a successful conflict management that may arise in the future, and also consensus building that may arise during the evaluation process. It is common that different stakeholders will always have very different perspectives regarding a particular matter, and it is also very normal that everyone will be trying to, of course, protect their interests. So depending on the degraded site in question, the steering team of the valuation will start off the process by defining an inclusion criteria for the identification and selection of stakeholders. This may incorporate things like the type of influence of the stakeholders, and this means the people who are affected by the policy that may result from the valuation, like the locals living within that ecosystem, as well as those who affect the policy. And this, we're talking about governments. It is also important to look at the spatial distribution of these stakeholders. And this is basically looking at a wide range of stakeholders identified from a micro to a macro level. And this may be the local on-site people, the local off-site people, the national level, the regional level, and even the global and the international wider society. So to achieve meaningful valuation results, obviously, the steering teams are encouraged to define applicable inclusion criteria so that to ensure the stakeholders identified are adequately representative. So I hope you're already getting the picture that this valuation process is actually a very intensive process that involves so many people. So the next step is the prioritization of these stakeholders. So you will realize that not all stakeholders that have been identified will prove to be directly relevant to a particular social economic valuation exercise. So we need to prioritize them to ensure that the project works within the most important stakeholders. So stakeholders will always vary in the degree of influence and importance. So they can be categorized according to whether they have relatively more or less influence or importance to the success of the valuation process. Importance here broadly refers to the degree to which the stakeholder is considered a focus of a decision that is to be made, while the influence refers to the level of power a stakeholder has to control the outcome of a decision. So besides categorizing the stakeholders into different levels of importance and influence, it is also important to look at the level of involvement of the stakeholders. So you'll find that certain stakeholders may need only to be notified of the outcome of the evaluation, while others may need to be fully and directly involved with the process. So stakeholders can broadly be categorized as primary stakeholders, and these are the ones that have very low influence over the outcome of the decisions, but their welfare is important to the decision makers. Often you'll find that these are the ones that who stand to lose the most from a decision, e.g. The local communities directly benefiting from the ecosystem. We also have the secondary stakeholders, and these are those that can influence decisions being made because they are predominantly decision makers and are engaged in implementing decisions. So you'll find that they are relatively unimportant as their welfare is not a priority, for example, the government, the local authorities, and so on and so forth. And then we have the external stakeholders, and these are those individuals or groups that exert an influence over the outcome of a process through lobbying the decision makers, but whose interests are not important. And for this, we are talking about NGOs, church groups, and so on and so forth. Now, the last step of a stakeholder analysis is the involvement of stakeholders. At this stage, it is very essential to identify what forms of participation is both desirable and feasible for the different actors in each stage of the evaluation process. Remember, in the team, you'll always have people of different calibers, from their educational background, their social statuses, and so on and so forth. So it is important to have a variety of approaches to get the most out of the engagement. So for this, different participatory stakeholder engagement techniques exist, and we have focus group discussions, interviews, questionnaires, and so on and so forth. So remember, the preliminary work phase is the most important step of social economic valuation processes because it sets out the stage for the implementation of the other succeeding steps. So the main aim is to get as much information as you can so that it is representative of all the stakeholders' interests. That's it for the preliminary phase. So let's quickly look at the scoping appraisal. And the scoping appraisal is whereby at this stage of the project, we are confident that the stakeholders are fully aware of the project's intentions. So what is done here is that the specific roles of each stakeholder and their respective expected level of engagement along the entire project implementation period are streamlined, ready to start the actual valuation process. So remember, the outcome of the valuation of ecosystem services is meant to strengthen decision making by providing information on the efficacy of the response of policies. So something that is very important to note is that if the value of the ecosystem service is misrepresented or even is absent in the decision making tool, then the outcome decision could very well lead to undesirable outcomes for the society at large. So considering this, there are two important aspects that the stakeholders must bear in mind while starting the implementation of the social economic valuation exercise. And the first one is the spatial dimension of the services. And this basically means looking into the location of delivery of the service, entering into the domain of beneficiaries. For example, if you are talking, for instance, if you're talking about the provision of timber by a certain forest ecosystem for building purposes, the location of service delivery could either be the locals that live around the forest, or even people from faraway markets where the timber is sold. So the other spatial dimension is to look at the location of the persons or groups responsible for allowing the services to flow. And this could be government bodies responsible for the regulation of cutting of those trees, and so on and so forth. So remember, all these are site specific, and the stakeholders will always be aware of the ground scenario. So basically, a perspective of the ecosystem service dimension will help the policy planners in designing what I would call efficient responses for management of these services and ecosystems. The other thing we need to look at is looking at the complementary and rivaling services. And this is where you find some services rival others, while others complement each other. For example, when you talk about carbon storage as an ecosystem service from the forests, and hydrological flows as yet another ecosystem service from the forests, these two clearly complement each other. On the flip side, when you talk about services like bioremediation by water, by lake water, and also the withdrawal of the same water for irrigation in, for instance, a wetland, you'll realize that these ones are rivaling each other. So understanding the complementary and rivalry nature of these services will really help to avoid double accounting of ecosystem service values. So the stepwise activities under scoping appraisal are normally performed in workshop settings and any other participatory platforms. So the first thing we normally do is to collect and collate available background information and existing data on the site. Depending on the site one is looking at, the background information may include the policy context of the site, and here the stakeholders can explore and understand and even clarify the existing policy context within which the evaluation is taking place. The other thing that is important to be done is a social economic overview, where the stakeholders are tasked to describe how the site is used and who benefits. So here the stakeholders are tasked to describe how the site is used and who benefits from the ecosystem services, as well as the perceived threats impacting on the ecosystem and how it is affecting the proper functioning and probably causing degradation. Remember, nothing is cast on stone, so the stakeholders can collect as much information as they wish, so long as they are relevant to the task at hand. So the next step under the scoping appraisal is to establish the important land uses or habitat types at the site in their current states. Here, classification of the land use and land cover or habitats types should be done. And here, remote sensing tools for land use land cover mapping are recommended. Something to note is that it is important to develop an accurate land use land cover map to ensure an accurate assessment. So at an organized workshop, the stakeholders will discuss the land use land cover maps of the degraded site. They will verify the accuracy of the same with specific reference to the total area of each land use type and the percentage of the degraded site occupied by each of the land use types. The third step under this appraisal, scoping appraisal, is to identify ecosystem services for valuation. At this stage, you'll realize that the stakeholders will do an inventory of the ecosystem services provided by the ecosystem in question. So the main aim of this step is to develop a checklist of the main and important services provided by the ecosystem in question. So this description may be supported by maps where applicable to show the spatial distribution of each service. So in most cases, this is a subjective process and is normally very dependent on aspects like the purpose and objectives of the valuation exercise that were developed, remember, during the preliminary work phase. It also depends on the stakeholders involved and their individual interests regarding the valuation process. It also depends on things like the ecological and social economic setting of the site in question. And that is why it is very important or very essential to make this process very participatory and to engage all relevant stakeholders in the process for an unbiased and objective output that could arise from opinion monopolization. So at an organized workshop, the stakeholders will be tasked to first identify all the ecosystem services provided by the degraded ecosystem in question, and then secondly, to prioritize the ecosystem services listed. So to achieve this, several participatory approaches can be applied. And I don't want to get into deeper discussion on them. You can, at a later time, peruse through the tutorial manual that has been provided for in your resource folder. So once the ecosystem services have been identified and prioritized by the stakeholders, it is necessary to translate the ecosystem services listed by the stakeholders to a common classification scheme. For example, the AMI classification that we talked about yesterday. And then this process would normally happen in a post-workshop phase. So this, in essence, should provide a good basis for standardization of the results, while also guaranteeing that stakeholders' perspectives are unbiased and fully comprehensible in the evaluation process. So finally, a selection of the ecosystem services for valuation is done, where the ecosystem services, according to the local stakeholders' perspectives, are further narrowed down to relevant ecosystem services to which biophysical and economic dimensions can be quantified. Remember, yesterday we talked about the fact that it is very important to identify the biophysical indicator for your ecosystem service. Ask yourself whether it's mappable or not, and then also look at the economic perspective of the spectrum and check whether the economic values for that particular quantified ecosystem service is available. So this will depend on the choice of the quantification and valuation methods that we talked about yesterday also, and also on data availability and the appropriateness of its use for the intended purpose. The next major step is the building of scenarios for plausible alternative future options. So this addresses some of the questions that were also raised yesterday about predicting the future performance of ecosystems. And let me say this is perhaps one of the most important steps in our social economic valuation process. This is because this step will actually determine the way forward regarding the future functionalities of any ecosystem in questions. So for the purpose of better and informed decision making by the stakeholders on the management of restoration options of the degraded ecosystem in question, it is actually very important to do a comparison between the ecosystem in its current state, that is now, and comparing it with an assumed alternative future scenario, which would be a management option or restoration option that the stakeholders have in mind. So to achieve this, the stakeholders will first have to identify the beneficiaries of the ecosystem service, and then identify the threats and activities that are currently impacting the ecosystem, resulting in degradation. And then finally, they will define now plausible alternative states, assuming different management or restoration options. The identification of the beneficiaries and the threats is a bit straightforward, so I won't talk about them, but in essence, the outcomes of the two are meant to create a platform where the current state of the degraded ecosystem can be compared to plausible alternative states in the next step. So allow me to delve deeper into defining the plausible scenarios for the future. So the scenarios aim to paint a clear picture of the possible outcomes in case of any chosen management strategy targeted at addressing the threats impacting on that particular ecosystem, and in principle aiding the decision makers in making informed decisions. So generally they want to view what the outcomes of the ecosystem would be in the future by looking at it now. So the decision makers normally will be concerned with the social, the ecological, and the economic consequences of their decisions. Remember, everything has to be cost effective. So if a management option is expensive, then it is not a viable management option. So they would be very curious to know the difference between the amounts of the ecosystem services provided by a site in its current state compared to a plausible alternative one, where, for instance, the degraded ecosystem is converted to other uses or even restored to its original state. So while undertaking this process, the stakeholders need to consider what will change in ecosystem service delivery as a result of a management or policy decision, and the impacts that the decisions made are likely to have on different groups of people in terms of the benefits they get from the site. So simple assessments using Earth observation data and existing economic values of the particular service will paint such visual pictures that will play a major role as a first step in understanding the importance of the site for delivering benefits to people now and even in the future. So the assessment of the expected differences resulting from perceived and assumed changes in the land use by the stakeholders are very useful and informative to decision makers, for they provide what we can say visual information on the comparative change in ecosystem services with possible futures. So some of the key considerations in determining the alternative state are things like policy and management context of the degraded site, the most likely threats and drivers of change that occurred in the past or are likely to occur in the future. We also have aspects like the ecological, the political and social attributes, and also the broader trends and issues in the locality of the degraded site in question. For example, the stakeholders should research whether there are any existing plans for the ecosystem, like development plans for the area, or even aspects like the existing management practices within that particular ecosystem. So in summary, the major components in determining future scenarios that the stakeholders may choose to consider include things like the transition likelihood of one land use to another, the physical and environmental factors that are likely to influence the change, and also the quantity of anticipated change under a given scenario. So just to simplify this, I want to illustrate briefly a simple case of a scenario building. So let's assume that the stakeholders have sat down and described the major land uses within their site. And as you can see on your screen, in this particular site, the current state as of March 2023, they have 4 major land uses in this particular ecosystem. So the settlements here cover 30% of the ecosystem area, while the forests cover 40%. We also have shrublands covering 20%, and finally we have the grassland covering the remaining 10%. And this is a very arbitrary situation, could be an ideal situation. But as we said, the land cover map should be very accurate if you want accurate assessments at the end of the day. So now the stakeholders will sit down and follow the whole process that we have discussed, with the main aim to see how best can they manage or even restore this particular degraded ecosystem to a better state. So they will look at the existing land uses and try and see what land use can be converted to what other land use to achieve the main objective that was set on the onset of the valuation process. Now that what you're seeing on the screen right now is an outcome of the one plausible alternative future state as decided by the stakeholders. As you can see, only 5% of the total land area has been proposed for settlements in the future. What does that mean? It tells you these people, they have a management option where they wish to have the sum of the people residing in the settlement area resettled elsewhere, and then have 25% of the current settlement area converted to other land uses. As you can see, in this case, they want 15% of this area to be converted to forest lands and 10% to be converted to grassland. For the forest area, as you can see, they want the current area covered by the forest to remain the same, however, with an additional area from the settlements and the shrubs, as I've said. For the shrublands, the area will reduce. As we have said, 10% will be converted to forest lands, while for the grasslands, as you can see, the existing area will remain the same, however, with an additional area from the settlement, and so on and so forth. You can draw as many conclusions from such future scenarios. So for every proposed conversion from one land use to the other, the stakeholders are encouraged or are mandated to also be tasked or are tasked to to propose soft landing options or alternatives for the affected beneficiaries. For instance, in this case, for the proposed conversion of settlements to forest land, the stakeholders need to have clear direction as to where the resettlement will take place and the cost implications of the same. So every option as proposed by the stakeholders will be screened, and such dynamics like the costs and benefits of each proposed intervention will be analyzed further to come up with the meaningful management or restoration options that are adoptable. So at the end of the scenario building, several other future options addressing different stakeholder needs will have been proposed, and this will then need further prioritization using different techniques to come up with only implementable and practical future options. The next step and last step in the preliminary decision making phase, as I have said, not all the proposed plausible options can be adopted. So because there is rarely an immediately preferable option, since there are always a range of management objectives. So at this stage, the future plausible management options proposed from the previous step are screened further, and different criteria can be applied for prudent decision making regarding the choices to be made. So there's a wide range of prioritization criteria, and we have approaches like the trade-off analysis, the multi-criteria analysis, and the cost-benefit analysis, which are just but a few flexible methods of analysis that can evaluate and rank the range of management options suggested by the stakeholders. So we've provided a tutorial that has further information about these methods and how they can be implemented. So remember, we said in decision making, any action or management action that maximizes benefits is more acceptable. So that is what the stakeholders need to look at achieving at the end of the day. So at the end of this process, the information of the chosen future plausible options are then collated and prepared for the valuation modeling process using tools like the Colwood model. So this will be done alongside the evaluation of the current state of the degraded ecosystem for comparison, and to also aid in better decision making at the end of the evaluation process. So the valuation modeling in this case is meant to aid in decision making by bringing in the monetized perspective of the chosen futures, and which can be considered a very dependable decision making platform. Now this is where the scoping appraisal ends, and this means we move to the last step, which describes how to package and communicate the economic values to the relevant decision makers with a prospect of implementation. So I'm intentionally leaving out step number 3 for obvious reasons, or rather because we already know how to implement the valuation modeling processes with experiences from the Colwood sessions that we've had since Monday. So remember, in the introduction session, we extensively discussed how the economic values of ecosystem services feed well into informed decision making, as well as how they guide the formulation of relevant policies targeting plausible future resource management options of degraded ecosystems. So basically in this section, we want to close this loop by understanding how these economic values can be packaged and communicated to the right decision-making institutions in a way that can easily capture their attention and assist in implementing restoration options for degraded sites. Remember, without a relevant audience, the valuation process is as good as nothing. Why? This is because no envisioned actions will actually take place. So it is therefore very essential that the value estimates of the ecosystem services, as well as the methodologies used to arrive at these estimates, are communicated and disseminated to all the relevant decision makers and stakeholders. So one needs to communicate these values to a broader group of stakeholders, firstly to those who use these services, and secondly to those who influence the decision making that governs that particular ecosystem management. So the methods used for dissemination should ensure that they not only provide the value estimates of the ecosystem services, but also provide the distribution of benefits associated with the use of those services, as well as the costs of managing or conserving the ecosystems across all the relevant stakeholders. So here, GIS-based data visualization tools and modes of representation would come in very handy in the process of visually communicating the economic value of products to the decision makers. I recall someone here, I think it was yesterday, asked why the output values of the colloid were being represented as maps and not numbers. So remember, the key thing is to be able to easily capture the attention of the decision makers and to be able to seamlessly tell a narrative that is convincing enough. And therefore, you'll find that maps arise as very important means of communication to provide the decision makers with information about the spatial distribution of the ecosystem service and the economic values as well. And also the anticipated trends that would be occasioned by the different plausible proposed future management options. So also with the exponential growth of people who are connected to the World Wide Web or the worldwide network of computers, the World Wide Web has become a very important vehicle for dissemination of information for everyone, with the most basic form of dissemination in the context of geospatial data being web maps and web applications, which are options that the stakeholders might want to consider depending on the target audience. So as far as decision makers are concerned, you'll find that the major task of evaluation process is to convince the decision makers that the benefits of conservation of ecosystems, which are expected to result in improved quality and flow of ecosystem services, outweighs the costs to be incurred while implementing the proposed management options. Remember, I talked about different methodologies for doing this, where you can apply the cost-benefit analysis, the trade-off analysis, we have the multi-criteria analysis, and so many other approaches. So the dissemination methods must demonstrate the contributions of these ecosystem services to the local, the regional, the national, and global economy, so as to build support for the conservation of ecosystems that provide these services. So finally, we have strategies for effective communication. And the first strategy that can be applied is to target the message to the audience. It is obvious that different decision makers and stakeholders will always have different information requirements, such that there is never one size fits all for content or strategy. So with an understanding of the information requirements and motivations of the stakeholders, the dissemination methods can be designed to compel attention and action. So the other strategy is to use a variety of communication methods. So the purpose of the evaluation, the type and range of stakeholders involved, and their role in the decision making, would determine the appropriate form and approach to be used for dissemination of value estimates of ecosystem services. So the communication methods would range from conducting dissemination workshops, distributing leaflets or flyers that provide information in a brief and easily understandable manner, as well as other web mapping and multimedia systems. So the other important strategy is to get feedback on communication approaches that are already being laid out, such that after the communication strategies are implemented, one needs to gather feedback on them and how they could be improved. Some of the important questions that the stakeholders need to address are whether the intended audience is receiving and understanding what is being communicated. It's important also to understand whether the intended audience feels like they are being bombarded with information on value estimates, and if yes, how the communication approaches can be more inclusive to include briefing on what can be done with these value estimates and their relevance. So in a nutshell, the overarching strategy for effective communication is to package information on ecosystem service values in a way that will capture the attention of relevant decision makers, while at the same time providing a vision and direction for setting meaningful and informed management actions towards achieving the overall goals and the associated benefits for improved ecosystem management. Now this marks the end of this presentation, and it is my hope that you have been able to learn something, in as much as I have really rushed through the step-by-step methodology. So I hope this is a process that you will be able to take up and implement within your respective countries towards the better management of our valuable natural resources. So also to mention is that we have a resource folder, and we have provided the detailed step-by-step methodology with examples of the activities that would normally take place in such processes. Otherwise, thank you so much for your attention.